Hi everyone, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Spring Webinar Series. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Initiative. My name is Audrey Dippo. I am the National Manager of the Climate Reality Project Canada. Just one second while Sorry about this. So our hope is that the creation of these hubs throughout the country will help raise the bar on climate action in Canadian cities. If you're not familiar with the Climate Reality Project, we train leaders to be ambassadors, to be climate reality leaders for climate action in their communities. This past March, we actually trained about 50 Canadians in Colorado. And by the way, the deadline for applying to the next free training in Seattle is next Tuesday. So if you're interested in being trained and haven't been trained before, go to climaterealityproject.org/training to register for that training. So climaterealityproject.org/training. So this webinar is part of a long series of events. You can see some of the upcoming events on your screen right now if you're joining this webinar via video conference. And you can sign up for the upcoming webinars at climatehub.ca. These webinars are meant to exchange best practices and tools that you can leverage in your own cities to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. So we hope you'll enjoy them. So today's webinar does exactly that. You'll learn about a few tools and resources. One of the things that we wanted to discuss is that smarter cities don't happen by accident. There's a lot of work involved. They're not necessarily more environmentally sustainable because they are smarter. But we're lucky to have Jean-François Barsoum with us tonight to discover how smart transportation can actually help solve converging challenges of traffic, air pollution, and climate change. Jean-François Barsoum has over 20 years of experience at IBM. He's been working on developing smart city concepts and understanding environmental impact since 2000. His role is to communicate and popularize innovation, smart city, and climate change concepts, and he actually gives dozens of presentations on those topics every year, whether at his workplace or as a volunteer. He regularly advises smart city startups for accelerators, during hackathons or pitch competitions, and he collaborates on large research collaborations with several Canadian universities. One interesting thing to know is that he's a director at the Climate Reality Project Canada. He's also director at the Canadian Water Network, and he's a member of AQTR's Smart Transportation Experts Committee on the World Road Association's Smart Transportation Working Group. He advises the Canadian government on clean tech programs, and he's on the board of directors of the Transportation Association of Canada's Foundation. And finally, he also belongs to the Urban Affairs Advisory Committee of the Montreal Chamber of Commerce. So with such an impressive expertise and experience, we are very, very lucky to have him with us to share his knowledge and his insights tonight. So welcome, Jean-François.
Thank you. So let me start my screen share and we can get into it. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation. So you'll notice the slides are in French and I'll be speaking in English, but obviously feel free to ask your questions in whichever language you'd prefer. And the topic I chose to concentrate on was around smart transportation and specifically the introduction of autonomous cars. You know, right now there's a major international public transit conference happening in Montreal. It's the IUTP, International Union for Public Transportation, and it is quite large, and there are a couple of autonomous buses kind of zooming around the site. So definitely a topic for discussion these days. So are we ready, and is the introduction of that car going to make a big difference? Now, one reason we really have to focus on where we're going in transportation is that it's really important not to make too many mistakes when you're building infrastructure. And like Frank Lloyd Wright mentioned, you know, a physician can bury his mistakes, but the architect can only advise his client to plant vines. So if you're building big highways and bridges and all kinds of transportation infrastructure, which may or may not turn out to be useful, it's very important to actually think ahead before you do that. because it could turn out to be a big, huge waste of money. So the first thing to understand is that the way that cities develop, even the notion of urban development has changed over the past few years. And if we think about how we used to think about growth, used to be about spreading out the city. And so over here, for those people who live in Montreal or not, you would, I can tell you this is the Champlain Bridge when it was built. Champlain Bridge is one of the busiest, if not the busiest bridge in the country, with I think 160,000 people crossing it every day. And you can see on the other side of the bridge, there's, you know, countryside. I was going to say there's nothing. No, there isn't nothing. There's countryside. There's, you know, lots of land being cultivated. And to think about the urban sprawl, you know, urban spread kind of method, you just have to look at what it looks like right now. And right now, the bridge sort of connects you to a huge suburb. And this is, you know, obviously just a piece of it. It's much, much bigger. So, you know, this is the way cities used to be built. And if you take a look at the way cities are built now, we look much more at densifying cities. And so here you have an example, or a fairly recent example. So here's London in 2006. So London, a relatively well-established city, you know, it's been around for hundreds of years. And you can see that even it is changing the way that it is building itself. It's densifying by building up. You know, new cities, so you have Dubai in the Middle East, which is clearly going through a densification process, so definitely building up. You have Shanghai, so in that case, we're going further out in Asia. That was in 1987. And, you know, this is what Shanghai looked a couple of years ago. You could probably add a couple buildings to that picture now. And so clearly we've changed the way we build cities. So why is that? Why have we made this change? And there's a relatively simple answer, which is that we simply can't move people across these big sprawling cities. You know, I'll just point out there's a toll on this picture, and it's not the toll booth that's slowing down traffic. It's clearly slowed down even before and after. So the tolling has nothing to do with it. I also noticed that half the highway is empty, even though nobody's moving. But still, this is not an isolated example. It doesn't really matter how many roads you add, you still end up with, you know, traffic. So adding roads and infrastructure do not necessarily alleviate traffic. And it doesn't matter if you're in China, as on the left, so that's a fairly famous traffic jam that lasted 10 days and was 100 kilometers long, or in France, which is your typical, you know, vacation time picture in the summer, or in Brazil. You know, clearly there's no lack of lanes in any of those pictures. There's plenty of road, but too many cars. But who does traffic really the best? Well, it's our neighbors to the south. And you can see here clearly an aerial view of Los Angeles, and you can see it's beautiful clearly, but way too many cars. Way too many cars. So, you know, what should we do about this? So what is the other option? Well, what we need to do is to increase the number of people that are being transported without necessarily adding more infrastructure. So that's the trick, increasing the number of people without increasing the infrastructure. And there are a few different ways to do that. I mean, the easiest way may not be the most effective way. The easiest way is to get smaller cars. Get smaller cars. Here in California, for example, you can lane split, so you can fit more cars in the same amount of space. That is one way you could do it. If you push that logic a bit further, you could say, well, why not motorcycles? And certainly in many Asian countries, you will see that motorcycles or scooters are highly encouraged and cars discouraged, and that's because you can fit many more. But there are some climate issues, and by that I mean cold weather in winter, that might prevent us from doing the same thing systematically in Canada. And That's also what applies to pushing much more active transportation. Now, there are many people who will ride their bikes in winter, but maybe not the majority. Certainly, though, that is a much more efficient use of city infrastructure, so that should be encouraged as much as possible. Probably the best way, though, to get the most people across a particular lane is to use public transportation, quite simply. So in a typical lane of traffic, you would consider that there are somewhere between 18 and 25,000 vehicles that can drive through. Now, in many North American cities, that's pretty much one passenger per car. Maybe you could say there's slightly more than one passenger per car, so maybe a few more than 18 to 25,000 people could go through one lane. But if you take a look at a bus rapid transit or a suburban rail line, you could go up to 7 to 40,000 people an hour, which means the theoretical limit is pretty close to 1 million people per day could transit through a single lane. Now, that's clearly a huge difference compared to the amount of people that you would get through a regular traffic lane. So certainly we need to encourage much more public transportation, but let's try and figure out then, so what do we do with cars in this world? And there are really 3 or 4 major trends that are emerging that are going to change the way cars interact with city development. And there are the 4 that you see on your screen now. So electrification, car sharing, connected cars, and autonomous cars. And 3 of those are relatively important. The 4th, maybe not so much, but I'll still go through each one of them, and I'll try to get to them in chronological order. So first one in chronological order, that trend started in 1884, so quite a few years ago, obviously, and that's electrification. So electric cars, first one, 1884. There's maybe been a lull for several decades, but certainly now we're getting more and more into electric cars, and there are many excellent reasons why we want to encourage electric cars to replace internal combustion engines. Some of it has to do with balance of trade, some of it has to do with air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, noise pollution. There are many different, even safety. Those cars tend to be safer vehicles than their equivalent internal combustion cars, in part because of the way crumple zones are designed in them. So many good reasons why we would want electric cars. However, alleviating traffic is not one of them. If you replace all the cars on the road that have combustion engines with electric motors, you're not doing anything about traffic. So you're not really going to have much impact on mobility. So, part of the answer may be in electric cars, but certainly not the whole part, maybe not even the major part. Second trend started in 1948, and that was the Selbstfahrergenossenschaft. And I'm on my 3rd time presenting this, so I'm almost getting the hang of that word. I think if you decompose it, you might be able to speak for 25 minutes using different parts of that word. But anyway, the first car sharing program happened in 1948 in post-war Zurich. And the idea was a number of homeowners and renters decided it was too expensive to get a car, so why couldn't they get together, buy one car, and share it amongst themselves for when they needed it? And that has clearly evolved over the years, and now there are many different ways that you can car share or that you can carpool. And so those are 2 relatively distinct words, carpooling and car sharing, but there are many different examples here. So, in terms of car sharing, you have services like Car2Go or Communauto and Automobile in Montreal. Basically, use a car when you need it. When you don't, somebody else uses it. There's a fleet of cars that's usable, and you pay by the minute or by the hour. Audi Unite on the top right is a slightly different model. So in Germany, what you can do is group buy one car. And so several families, rather than each buy a second car, might say, let's get together, share a car, and then that car can be reserved and located using an application that Audi provides. So it's a way to reduce the number of cars that are on the road. And then there are, taxi pooling, carpooling services, professional carpooling, amateur taxi, however you want to call them, like Lyft, for example. And of course, the other example would be Uber, and many of you know those services. Now, what's interesting is that every single car manufacturer around has, shares, owns, or has started a car sharing or carpooling service. So you have some of the examples on the screen now. Volkswagen has bought Get, which is an Israeli firm. Toyota has invested in Uber. GM has started Maven and invested in Lyft. Ford has invested in a venture called GoDrive. BMW has Reach Now. Car2Go is owned by Daimler. Apple has bought into Didi, and so you might say that Apple's not making cars, and I would say no, they're not yet, certainly, but they are talking about making the brains of cars, so that's interesting. Audi I just talked about, and Tesla is going to start a Tesla network for Tesla owners to share their cars once they get self-driving capability. So there's definitely an interest, and why there's an interest is that each of these manufacturers believes that eventually they will sell cars not to individuals, but to fleets. And so they have better owned fleets. Now, there's car sharing or carpooling 2.0. For example, Uber Pool that will pick up a passenger and a second passenger, drop off the first passenger, pick up a third passenger, and so on. And what that is essentially a dynamic bus route that Uber is building on the fly based on who's requesting to go where, and assigning the appropriate car to take those people where they need to go with the minimum amount of detour. So that's a very interesting development, certainly more efficient than the typical Lyft or Uber model that basically has a driver driving around just like a taxi driver, and most of the time not necessarily being productive. So this is much more productive, but it certainly drives a few questions around, well, what are we going to do about public transport? If we start building all these dynamic bus routes that are essentially private, are we still going to need buses in suburban places, in Richmond Hill, in Burnaby, in Laval? Are we still going to need buses? And so maybe, maybe not. Then there's the question about parking. In many cities, there's reserved parking for car sharing, but there probably isn't enough if we really want to drive major change. So these questions we're going to have to address. Connected car, I'm not going to say much. The first connected car was in 1996, was the first OnStar vehicle. And that's really for information, entertainment, and a tiny bit for safety. The new generation of connected cars just started last year with Cadillac, and a car can broadcast some information to another car and receive information from a traffic light that says, you should really stop because my light is red. There's not much I'm going to say about that because that technology is going to be deployed regardless, and it's mostly a safety improvement, but it doesn't really change much about traffic. So then we get into autonomous cars, and autonomous cars, there are many different kinds. Sometimes you're not really supposed to let go of the wheel yet in a Tesla, but many people do to show off for the camera. I know I've done that more than once, but eventually you'll be able to drive your car in many different conditions, and that's an example of what software can do right now that you'll see on your screen. The car is slowing down, is stopping at crossings, at stop signs. It will stop for traffic lights, and that's all done through cameras and LiDAR, so different kinds of sensors. So you might tell me, well, that's not realistic. That's broad daylight, but that same mechanism also works at night, as you can see on your screen there, and will even slow down for a raccoon as it crosses the road. So the software is getting sophisticated. That's where it is right now, and certainly it will get even more sophisticated as the years go by. Right now let me see if I can take the sound off here. So right now in Phoenix, Waymo, which is Google's company, is allowing people to basically rent taxis that are autonomous. So there's still a driver there, but the driver's not required. The vehicle is autonomous. And if you're even more ambitious, you can print your own vehicle. So you can print an ollie using a large 3D printer that's run with Watson artificial intelligence that you can talk to. Now you might tell me, but that's not realistic. Obviously, I'm not going to do that. Okay, well, maybe you'll buy an Audi or Mercedes at the end of the year, which will be mostly self-driving. So this is very much a reality now. But the question is, there are many questions there, and one of them is around empty vehicles. So what happens if the car is autonomous and I decide I don't want to pay for parking at work, I'll just send the empty car at home. And maybe once it's home, it'll drive my kids to soccer and then it'll drive home empty again. So are we going to end up with a bunch of empty cars driving around the roads? Or are we going to be encouraging people to live further away from work because the car is autonomous anyway? So, I'm going to skip this question about where artificial intelligence is, but certainly artificial intelligence is one of the major drivers of development of autonomous cars, and Canada has a particular strength in AI technology. So we may see more and more of these developments here. But of course, governments aren't able to keep up with these new modes of transportation. Before it was pretty clear you had public transportation, taxis, and private cars, but now what you have is just a ton of different modes of transportation, different models, different business models, and governments don't know what to do, and at the same time aren't preparing citizens for what might happen. And here's an example. I'll take the sound off again, but if you imagine crossing the road, typically you want to make eye contact with the driver, but if the driver is playing guitar or blowing balloons or just plain sleeping, you're not really going to know when is the good time to cross. So in this particular video, you see they've equipped the car with an emoticon essentially telling you it's safe to go. So we're going to have to rethink the way cars look and act around people. And so what we're going to need, in fact, is to focus on three things: cars that are autonomous and safe, cars that are clean and electric, and cars that are shared. And so there are fewer of them on the road. And if you think of them as a flow, if we have more autonomous cars, we're more likely to share them. And if we're more likely to share them, they'll rack up more miles, which makes it easier to justify the investment in electric vehicles. So if we do this right, we may end up with all three factors. But for that, certainly, we need to encourage car sharing much more than we are now. Helsinki is doing some of that by creating what they call mobility as a service, which is basically allowing people to order whatever kind of transportation they need at whatever time using an app. So whether they need a car or a bike or a bus, whether it's shared or private or a taxi, they can just use that one app and pay one type of fare, one kind of monthly fare to do that. And that's one way to get people to let go of their cars. Now, if you think about what might happen in a few years in the future, we may end up with tunnels. Now, I don't know if that will happen anytime soon, but certainly the founder of Tesla has invested heavily into technology that, will, according to him, eventually allow us to build lots of tunnels underneath cities. I don't know if that will happen soon, but he's already got his first tunnel building machine, so I wouldn't bet against him. And we may even see flying cars, and we've been talking about it since the 50s when it was just around the corner. But the difference now is that there are actually prototypes that are flying. So you have a 2-passenger personal car there that is flying that can go 300 kilometers an hour. So it can fly for basically an hour, fully electric. We may see this in our lifetime. So there are many things that will change around transportation. And all of those changes require us to think very deeply about how we finance and plan structures and mobility. One thing we have to stop doing is adding highways, adding bridges. We have to stop building capacity, because all these changes will take a lot of pressure, can take a lot of pressure off capacity. and so don't require building more. And if we build more, it's certainly not going to be helpful. So are we ready to change? It kind of depends who you listen to. If you listen to, what I will call a certain brand of populist radio, or writers or journalists, they will say we absolutely need more lanes and we can't share them. But really, based on all that technology, I think it's pretty clear we need to stay away from capacity building and focus more on the technologies that are going to allow us to have fewer cars on the roads. So that's all I had for you today, and I will stop share and hand the screen back over to your moderators.
Thank you so much, Jean-François, for sharing your expertise with us today. I would like to encourage everyone to think about questions that you'll be able to ask. You can start putting those questions in the Q&A right now, and we'll be addressing them in a few moments. In the meantime, I would like to give you a quick rundown of exactly what we're proposing in terms of action for this campaign, the Community Climate Hubs campaign. So I'll just pull up a couple of additional slides. And there we are, sorry. Okay. Voila. So what we've got right now across Canada are hubs of citizens that are willing to take action on climate, and they're willing to become, experts of their local daily lives and say to their elected officials, we'd love to see this, this, and this in our city. And it's through this kind of public education campaign, through webinars like the one today that describe solutions that are coming and describe traps that we could fall into if we're not careful, that we hope to equip citizens across the country with the solutions that they can then take to their elected officials and say, we want to see ambitious action on climate and at the same time improve traffic in our city, improve quality of life in our city. So very quickly, we have 6 hubs across the country at the moment. Well, we're in development, particularly on the West Coast, but the 4 kind of further to the east are well underway. Vancouver, Calgary, Saskatoon, Toronto, Vaudreuil, Soulanges, and Montreal. And the objective of those hubs is to move their communities along the 5 steps of the Partners for Climate Protection program set out by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So I won't get into too much detail there, but you can visit climatehub.ca. And ideally, in the mid to long term, we hope to set up a benchmarking between these hubs that will start popping up in, we aim for 20 cities by the end of 2017. And we'd like to be able to say, hey, look what Vancouver's doing on governance. How is their city taking action on climate by being more transparent, by being more democratic in the way it manages? What is Quebec City doing on transportation? Perhaps someday they'll take a lead in that respect. And so that is in the pipeline, so to speak. And we're really much looking forward to having these hubs coordinate between themselves. But for now, the objective is to establish communities that are willing to act together and focus on local climate solutions. So at that, I will ask you, I'll leave the floor to you and to Roland, who will take questions. We're a little bit over time, but hopefully those of you that can stick around for a few more minutes will be able to ask Jean-François and myself questions about either transportation or the campaign itself. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to start with Yamin Pouli, who asks, what do you think the individual citizen can do to help move this forward?
So, well, that's a good question, but certainly if we believe that that car sharing, as I do, that car sharing is really the important nut to crack, then I would say, join the car sharing service. Encourage people to join a car sharing service. Try and whether that's Car2Go or Communauto or whatever, and people that and if you're already doing that, and if that's already how you transport, try to invite your friends in with you so they see what it's like to get rid of the car. I think for many people there's a there's a cultural barrier to giving up your car. They're not sure if they'll be able to manage. But if they see someone that's able to manage without a second car, even without a primary car, then, you know, that is one way to do it. So I'd certainly encourage to push on that one. If you do have a car, then obviously I'm not saying you should sell your car and change to electric right away, but A, consider not buying one, but B, if you absolutely do have to buy it, see if you can go electric. And if you do have one, see if there's a way for you to share it. And there are personal car sharing services like Turo, for example, that will allow you to rent out your car for a day at a time. So that's one way to take cars off the road. So those are two areas I think I would focus on.
With respect to car sharing, I know that in Montreal there's a difficulty in terms of the policies at the city level. The city will not allow car sharing services to park in the downtown area, which makes the solution much less attractive for a number of consumers. So that is another way that we can, together as citizens, propose solutions to the city and say, hey, listen, if you want citizens to make this step, to take the leap and say, okay, I'm gonna try without one car, or try without two at least, then you need to make the alternatives more attractive by allowing them to park, you know, for example.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, there are definitely a few cities where the parking issue is very interesting. I think in Montreal that's changing, right? They're going to allow electric shared cars to park downtown. So, you know, that's a halfway answer, but it's certainly not ideal.
Thank you very much. So our next question is from Claire Defarge, who says, you mentioned in your presentation that only public transportation can solve the traffic issue and allow us to stop adding new lanes, traffic lanes. Yet you conclude about shared, connected, and electric cars. So how do you see the future of public transportation with respect to the traffic issue?
So you know, I was just focusing on cars, and I did say before getting into the car section that the best solution is to get as much public transportation as possible. So that should be the primary objective. And even beyond that, you should be focused even on active transportation. So getting people to walk and bike more. So, you know, in that order, walk and bike, public transportation, and then, you know, car sharing. But what's likely to happen with electric car sharing services, autonomous car sharing services, is there's going to be a rebalancing of who's going to do what. So, you know, in many cases right now, there's no critical mass of people in less dense neighborhoods. So I was mentioning, you know, some suburbs, for example. You could think of, I'll pick on Richmond Hill or Markham, where, you know, public transportation might not be ideal. There's not that much frequency. So, and so there's a feedback loop, or negative feedback loop, where there aren't enough buses because there aren't enough people. So people tend to stick to their cars. So therefore, there are no buses, there's no bus service that's offered. But with autonomous, and part of the reason, of course, is that, you know, drivers are, you know, about half the operational cost of running a bus service. So certainly you don't want to run a bus with, you know, 6 places in it, because that would be probably a huge waste of money. So you need to run a bus that has, you know, 40 or 50 spots in it in order for it to pay off. So there's a limit at which public transportation will work if you rely on drivers. Now, what autonomous shared vehicles might bring is essentially a smaller, reduced version of public transportation to areas that right now can't get public transportation because they're too spread out. Now, ideally, we would re-densify those neighborhoods, but we know that can't happen overnight. Now, if we have more public transportation, fewer cars, people will start demanding that they have, proximity services is what we call them, but local stores and shops that they can walk to. Once you get rid of your car, it starts becoming kind of important that you can walk places, you know, and not always have to rely on, calling an autonomous car to get somewhere. And so there we may see future demand for densification in those neighborhoods. And that may mean replacing parking lots. So we have many parking lots in suburbs, and those parking lots are there to serve the needs of the people who are driving in suburbs because they have to drive because they live there. So you go to Canadian Tire, again, I'll pick on, well, let's say Burnaby, whatever. You have a parking lot in Burnaby around a Canadian Tire, and you have it there because people need to drive there. But if people don't need to park anymore because the cars are autonomous and shared and just keep moving on after they've dropped you off, well, that whole area becomes ripe for redevelopment. So you can put more residences, you can put more parks, you can put smaller stores there. So you could redefine what suburbs look like eventually. But in order to prime the pump, you really need to change the way people move. And so I think the requirement, especially for less densely populated areas, is going to have to be the switch to electric shared autonomous vehicles.
Thank you very much. So the last question that I'm seeing is in French, and I'll leave it up to you, Jean-François, how you prefer to answer it, whether in English or French.
So
it's quite long, so
that's
from Louise. Yeah.
Okay. Louise, OK. En Chine, les composants d'air climatisé fondent lors des épisodes de canicule. Jusqu'à quel degré de réchauffement les composantes électroniques des voitures autonomes peuvent-elles rouler? En Inde, l'asphalte fond sous la chaleur. Cette orientation vers plus de technologie va-t-elle contribuer à limiter les émissions de gaz à effet de serre suffisamment rapidement pour éviter qu'on ne puisse plus rouler? Alors, deux choses là-dessus. D'abord, c'est possible de construire des composantes très solides pour les voitures autonomes et qui pourraient résister à des grandes chaleurs. D'ailleurs, ça se fait déjà. Il y a des composantes à l'intérieur des moteurs qui doivent subir la chaleur beaucoup plus importante que ce qu'on vit dans des canicules. Moi, je dirais que ces composantes d'air climatisé qui fondent ne sont peut-être pas nécessairement très bien construites non plus. Est-ce que ça va être assez pour ralentir? Est-ce que ça va être assez pour arrêter les changements climatiques? Probablement pas. Mais par contre, on sait que dans des endroits comme au Canada en particulier, comme au Québec à l'intérieur du Canada, les gaz à effet de serre qui viennent des transports viennent contribuer à peu près la moitié du bilan. Donc, si on arrive à réduire les gaz à effet de serre provenant des transports en faisant ces trois changements, je pense qu'on peut faire quand même un grand bout de chemin. C'est certain que si on ne fait pas de progrès en transport, on aura beaucoup de difficultés à améliorer notre bilan. Mais si on fait un effort du côté des transports, je pense qu'il y a une chance qu'on puisse arriver certainement à atteindre nos objectifs à moyen terme.
Thank you very much. So as we wrap up our Q&A session, I would invite people to post their last and final questions on the question board. In the meantime, I personally would like to ask you a question, that being, how would you encourage the uptake of services like Lyft or Car2Go for low-income individuals who might not have the immediate financial access, say a credit card, to acquire these services?
So there are a couple of examples. There's one city in Ontario called Innisfil that's actually subsidizing Uber to provide public transportation in their city. So that may be a model. Now, maybe it's not Uber, maybe it's Lyft, maybe it's somebody else. So that is one model. In the suburbs of Montreal here in Brossard, there's a startup called NetLift, which works on a different model, which is much more around carpooling. So let's say you are going to work anyway. Well, NetLift will pair you up with someone that is going essentially from where you are going to approximately where you are going, and will give you a smaller amount of cash for that. Let's say $5. So that might be enough for you to pay for gas, but it's not going to be, as much as what a taxi would cost. So NetLift has had quite a bit of success with that, and the city is partly funding that example. So I would certainly look at those two models as being possibilities on how we can rethink how carpooling and car sharing could help. But in many cases, what governments can do best is, and I'm going to sound like you know, like somebody that's from the hard right, but I'm clearly not. But we have to rethink regulation in transportation. We've been very rigid about what constitutes public transit, how you get a taxi, what kinds of permits you need, what are the rules for that, and maybe we need to rethink that so that we don't encourage people to keep cars, and rather we push more people towards shared vehicles.
Thank you very much. So our last question, not really a question, more, I guess, a request for you to comment. I don't know if you see Claude Couture asked, between the three options of going fully electric, what would be your opinion on preparing an intelligent transportation fleet as soon as possible?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that question. Let me just pull it up. It's on the QR. Let me just.
That's right.
Yeah. So, government incentives to purchase electric cars, incentives to transform actual cars with electric engines. Let's prepare it. Yeah, so I'm not sure how quick the transformation would go. I mean, typically it's not worth converting an existing car into an electric car. The cost is much too high to make that feasible. So I'm not sure about the second one. Certainly, government incentive to purchase electric cars, I think, is fine. I think, you know, you could work the other way around, which is have a disincentive for gasoline cars, but certainly you can look at the fiscal aspect. You may even look at kilometer tolling to encourage or discourage different times of day. I think looking at how we collect and spend money is very, very important. So, you know, I would say that is definitely core. And preparing for intelligent transportation as soon as possible. Yes, absolutely. And I think part of the issue we have right now is governments aren't necessarily aware or interested. I think once we start seeing autonomous cars, and you know, Tesla is going to be running a car with no human intervention from LA to New York by the end of this year. So that will become front of mind very quickly. But again, if we don't think about the regulations around that and how we encourage people to share cars, having more autonomous cars on the road is not necessarily a good thing. So we should really focus a lot more on car sharing, I think, is one aspect to that. So Fred asked about Innisfil. So yes, I think that's definitely a good to see your name, Fred. It's been a while since we've connected, but yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect. I think we will see more cities that are deciding to devolve public transportation to companies like Uber. So I think it's an interesting experiment, at least to run for now. And
sorry, Jean-François, could you just give a bit of background on what this is and how it's affecting Ontario?
Sure. So Innisfil is a relatively small town in Ontario, which you know, probably does not have the critical mass to run a full public transportation bus service. And if it did, it certainly wouldn't be frequent enough to get people to change their habits. So what they've asked Uber to do is basically for Uber to run public transportation. So they'll give Uber some money, so the rates are cheaper. And so they can give people rides. So, you know, individuals in Innisfil give other people rides and may even create Uber pool lines, so dynamic bus lines, the same way that they would do in a large city. Now, Innisfil by itself probably wouldn't be a prime target market for Uber because of its size, but certainly because of the attractiveness of having public investment in that does make it interesting. And so Innisfil achieves its goals of getting public transportation cheaper than it would have done, well, it probably couldn't have done otherwise. And at the same time, Uber gets to develop a new business model. So it's probably, you know, good for both of those. Now, I hope other companies get into it. We probably don't want to be in a situation where one company runs public transportation everywhere. That happened before with GM, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing. So we do want you know, some further competition in that space, but I think experimentation is a good idea.
All right, so it looks like that's it for the Q&A session. If anybody has any further questions for Climate Reality or Jean-François, contact information will be provided, and I will pass it on to Audrey to end the session.
Thanks, Roland, and thanks a lot, Jean-François. That was very interesting, as always. I always learn something new from your presentations. So thanks for being with us, everyone. I hope you've come away with some knowledge, some inspiration to get active in your communities. I certainly have. And so the talk is going to be on community organizing. Our speaker is Cam Shima. He's a national organizer for the Blue Dot Movement, and he works for the David Suzuki Foundation. So that's next Thursday, the 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So join us for that. Same link, climatehub.ca. We're looking forward to seeing you there. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.